Okay, good to be here with everyone again. Let me take my jacket off. Make myself at home. And talk about this. Spend some time having this conversation around crossing the street. So I first want to start off by introducing a word to you all. It's a word actually from the Zulu language that means hello, but it actually has a little bit of deeper meaning. Everyone say sawubona.
Sawubona.
Say it again, sawubona.
Sawubona.
One more time, sawubona.
Sawubona.
So sawubona in the Zulu means I see you. Right? And then the response is sikona. Everyone say sikona.
Sikona.
Say it again, sikona.
Sikona.
One more time, sikona.
Sikona.
Now sikona means because you see me, I am now here. Sawubona, I see you. Sikona, and because you see me, I am now here. It kind of holds this idea that people are not just present because they're physically present, but there's actually some type of interaction that has to happen to really bring people kind of into our space together. So I'm kind of going to be using that theme a little bit as we talk about this notion of crossing the street. And so here's what I'm thinking we'll do during this time. I'm going to tell some stories. I'll probably say a couple controversial things. So everybody take your imaginary seatbelt, pull it across your waist. I promise you, anything that you potentially could disagree with me around is not going to kill us. We're going to make it. Right? There's a social prophet named Kendrick Lamar who says we're going to be all right. Right? So we're going to make it. All right? But I'm going to share some stories, kind of talk about this notion of peacemaking, and really try to kind of bring us from maybe the sermon conversation upstairs into some practical stories on how this has kind of been lived out in my life and the lives of others, and then us to think about. Hopefully that just creates space for you all to ask some questions and challenge some of the ideas and notions. And maybe it might not be controversial at all. So let me first off and say that when I talk about peacemaking, I always want to make clear I'm not talking about peacekeeping. We're talking about peacemaking. Jesus calls us blessed are the peacemakers, right? Because they will be called the children of God. Peacekeeping is about maintaining the status quo. Peacemaking, by definition, is about inserting oneself into obvious conflict to reconcile differing parties, right? And so Jesus, doesn't call us to be peacekeepers, right? He actually calls us to be peacemakers, which means we're actually going to have to step into some obvious conflict and deal with some stuff. So I want to share a little bit about some of my own story, kind of what called me into that. So I finished off sharing, 10 years ago I moved to Oakland and got involved in the violence reduction work and, have been doing all of that, which had been very kind of formative work and was peacemaking work within itself. I didn't grow up in the hood. I was doing a presentation before for some police, and the guy was like, I thought you grew up in the hood. And I was like, I don't know how to quite feel like that, right? Do I look hood? I mean, let's have a conversation about that. But that's another conversation. So I grew up in San Francisco, middle class family, relatively had a very privileged journey. My dad drove Muni for 40 years in the city, back when you get those good city pensions, and they're all gone now. And my mother was a school teacher for 44 years. I'm the third child of 6. Myself and all my brothers ended up becoming pastors. And we all say we don't know whether that's because of God's call or they just took us to church too much. We don't know. we let people be the judge of that. But we all ended up in a life of ministry. So That's how I'm entering the story, the conversation we're going to talk about, right? And the reason I want to tell that story on the front end is because I think it's always important for us when we start thinking about the notions of peacemaking is to understand where we are and what lens we're seeing through, right? Because we all have a lens, the way we've been brought up, that's informing the way we're experiencing what's happening in the world. And it also impacts the way that we also think about Scripture. And then ultimately what that informs us to do or what it restricts us to do, right? So I was doing some training for some faith leaders before, and you know, I was telling them I wanted them to start using, I'm going to talk about it in a few minutes, but I started telling them I wanted them to use a Ferguson hermeneutic.
What?
A Ferguson, I'm going to talk about the story of Ferguson in a minute. Some of y'all remember Ferguson?
Yeah.
So I told them I want y'all to use Ferguson as a lens to read the Scripture. I'm about to talk about that in a minute. And one of them was like, well, if you're asking us to use that as a lens, well, obviously, we'll see some of the things that you want us to see. And I told them, as if you're not already reading the Bible through a lens. The question I'm lifting up is, what lens are you reading it through? Right? And we all have a lens that's informed by our story. And the reason I start off with this idea of salvo bone is because if we're going to be peacemakers, that means that we're going to have to expand the lenses that we're experiencing, reading the Scriptures through, seeing the world through, which means that other people's story, pain, and experience really doesn't become real for us until we fully see them. We don't have to agree, right? We don't. Their story doesn't have to be our story, but figuring out how we create space to hear their story and allow that story to really inform us. So I was doing violence work in Oakland, was feeling really good about that. That was deep, hard work. Sitting across the table from particularly young brothers who were involved in a lot of the gun violence in Oakland. Yeah, I mean, I could just tell stories and stories on that. But it was deeply transformative for me, learning how to see the image of God in people who we have vilified, right? And then being able to learn and think about seeing them as the product of a larger system that actually is creating it, making it more likely for some folks to end up in certain situations versus others. So I was doing that work. I was feeling pretty self-righteous and good about myself. We launched these night walks in Oakland, so we were walking the streets of Oakland Friday, Saturday, and Sunday, you know, taking community from 7 to 8, 9 o'clock at night. And then there was more of a kind of strategic group of us that were walking between 11 p.m. and 2 in the morning. So we were out there building relationships with people that were most at risk. You know, one of the interesting notions about gun violence in you know, urban communities, which is just really code for saying black and brown communities, but so I'm just gonna say black and brown, we can say the code for later, right? So in black and brown communities, it's actually less than 1% of those cities that are causing 60 to 70% of homicides. So it's actually a small group of people. In Oakland, what that became for us was that it was about 1,000 people that belonged to about 40 to 50 street groups, and out of that 1,000 people, it was about 250 shooters. So in the city of 400,000, once we started working with the academics and the data analysts, we figured out there was about 250 people that we needed to engage to bring down the homicides, and then ultimately also affect the other 750 people, and we could really reduce the homicides by a significant amount. So we were out doing all of that work, and a part of that work got us involved in also trying to figure out how to build relationships with law enforcement, which was a big problem for me, right? Gonna keep it real, right? Because the only gun that I've ever stared down is that of a police officer when I was 18 years old in San Francisco. I was putting myself actually through college right out, well, not out here, San Mateo and Skyline. So I was working as a security guard at night, put myself through school during the day, got off, decided that day I was going to take off my security uniform. This is the only day since I worked down there on Sansom Street that I decided I'm going to take my security uniform on and put on my Orlando Magic Shaquille O'Neal jersey. So you know that goes back a little while, right? That's when Shaq was skinny, right? So I decided, you know, I'm going to put on my Shaq jersey and these little Elise tennis shoes that I thought was so great. And I'm gonna go ahead and head home at 11 o'clock at night in my fancy outfit for nobody to see because it was night, but I think I just got paid or something like that and I was feeling good about it. In any case, I'm coming down the street, officers come flying up the other way, they jump out, put put your hands up, put your effing hands up. I hear guns cocked, and my hands go up in the air, and I'm scared for my life in that moment that I'm about to be killed. Right? Sit there, you know, and hung out there for a while. You know, said the guy they were looking for was 6'6". I'm not 6'6". Wish I was 6'6". But ended up, you know, being held out an hour or something. Walked up to me. All right, you can go. This happened about 9 to 10 months after my brother Mike was beat up by the police in San Jose. He was a Bible college student. They pulled him out of the car. They were looking for Michael T. McBride. My brother's Michael T. McBride. But because they didn't check the license and just pulled him out, he ended up getting beat up by the police. Ended up suing the San Jose Police Department. That also existed inside a larger story for me of my dad being arrested with Dr. King during the civil rights movement when my dad was a kid. He said Dr. King came, took him and the rest of the kids and showed them the back of the colored fountains and the white fountains in the South. And he said he showed them the main water pipe running to both fountains. My dad said it wasn't until that moment that I actually realized we were drinking the same water. I always wondered if we were drinking like the dirtier water or whatever. He said, but Dr. King showed us that basically the only thing that was different was what people were making out on the front end. Has his mind-opening experience. But then he's arrested with Dr. King in a student protest. He says we're squished into a jail cell. We're all in there. They're kids. Now they're crying. They're urinating, defecating on themselves. And the white police officers are standing outside of the cell laughing at them. Right? My great uncle, Willie McBride, was killed by the KKK in North Carolina. It was rumored in the community that they were off-duty police officers. He was hit over the head with a hammer and left on the railroad tracks. So everybody say Sawubona. So I said earlier for folks that were coming, Sawubona in the Zulu language means I see you. Sikona means, and because you see me, I am now here. Everybody take a deep breath in, let it out. And what I want us to hold, right, and I know my sister can attest to this, what I just shared is a pretty, maybe not to that extreme, but consistent experience for a lot of black people in this country. This is our story. And so the most difficult dynamics when we start talking about peacemaking is when people will not believe that story. Or people who are not connected to that story will question how we seek to make peace in light of that story. Right? So I just told you a 4-generation racial terror story that involves policing and the government structure. So the notion that I should think about police as good, as in my interests, as there to protect me, is not in my story. Right? Now let me say this because I don't want, again, seatbelt, keep seatbelt on, right? Yes. My cousin is a police officer. 2 of my cousins are police officers. Right? And I love them. Right? One is actually on the San Bruno Police Department. But what I want us to hold is this notion that peacemaking means that we gotta lean into the reality that there's multiple truths happening at the same time. We gotta be able to open up ourselves to hear that. So I want to give y'all that story to say, so I'm doing the work around violence. We're trying to work on that stuff, and then that also involved working with the police, which was a challenge for me because of the stories that I just shared. But in any case, we started leaning into it because we recognized that we were only going to bring about the change that we needed to do by working together. Right? We weren't going to be able to do it apart from one another. We were going to have to work together. So all of that was happening. We were being successful for at least a couple years now, working with law enforcement and community to bring about peace. And then I got involved in training Oakland's police department around something called procedural justice and implicit bias. So I started training the police, and we were just getting ready to get started. I'd done 1 or 2 sessions of starting to train the police, and then August 9th happened in 2014. Anybody know what happened August 9th, 2014? I'm sorry? Ferguson. Michael Brown was killed in Ferguson, Missouri, August 9th, 2014. So I saw that. Now, just the experience I just gave you all, right? I saw Mike Brown, 18 years old, big brown-skinned brother. And what did I think about myself? right? So I became very upset around what was happening. And I was on my way to go train Oakland Police Department like 2 days later. I'm driving from San Jose, and as I'm coming down, I felt like the Spirit told me, now I'm gonna give you a couple opportunities. I mean, you got 2 opportunities in front of you. One, you can go in and just vomit all over them, all your frustration, right? Because you got the podium and you got the microphone. You can just go let it out of you. Or I could go in and try to figure out how to use that opportunity instead of to break, but also to bridge. So I took that opportunity to bridge. So that's one expression of peacemaking, of thinking about how do we manage our own trauma and our pain and look for opportunities to bridge. But then the other thing I had to do, and I also felt the Spirit prodded me to do, was to bear witness. Everybody say bear witness.
Bear witness.
So I was getting upset, around what was happening. My brother went out to Ferguson. We got called initially by one of the faith leaders in Ferguson, in St. Louis actually. Because of our violence reduction work, she called and said, this was the initial call, because I was not into activism and justice, all like that. This is like 5 years, right? She called us and said, we can't get the young people out of the street. Can you come to Ferguson? Because y'all know how to work with the young people. So can you come and help get the young people out the street? My brother went, I couldn't go because a pipe burst in our home and, flooded out the first floor. And if I would have left my wife for $3 in that flooded out home, I was gonna have a Ferguson in my own living room. I was like, you go, I gotta stay. Well, as my brother is hit me back, text me back, I'm watching the live streams on Twitter and other things, and he's telling me, the police are out here calling us niggers. They pushed a gun in my back and said, ooh, 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 can you speak English? Go back to Africa. And I was, it just was frustrating me. So, I was doing what a lot of us do. Well, maybe, some of us do, some circles, depends. We go on Facebook, right? You're upset about something, go on Facebook, right? Which is probably not helpful either. But I went on Facebook and went off, started doing my Facebook page. But I appreciate, I had one of my sisters called me and she said, Ben, we just don't need you upset. When Jesus went into the temple and he saw the injustice of what was happening in the temple, it says that he went out, he threaded a whip, he came in and he drove the injustice out of the temple. And she asked me an important question. What is the whip that God is calling you to thread in this moment? That was a life-changing conversation that I had with Heidi. In any case, the Spirit told me to go to Ferguson. So I got on the plane after I got my family situated, and I went to Ferguson. So I was in Ferguson during the uprising, back and forth, for about 40 days. So I was there on the ground. We had more time. We got to stop at 12:30, right?
Yeah.
Okay, so I'm gonna hurry up and get to a couple of these things so then we can have some questions. So I was there in Ferguson. So interesting what was happening versus how the media portrayed what was happening. But once I got to Ferguson, a couple quick stories I'll tell. I had to realize that Ferguson wasn't just about police killing black folks. There was a larger construct around how the system has utterly failed people of color and is designed to keep them without access to resources, upward mobility, and effectively freedom. And there was one night where I was out there on the protest line. I had never protested a day in my life until I got first. Never. I wasn't about protesting. I used to be like, I'm not really into that, And I remember the first day when I was out there and the young brother said, come on, we about to block the street. And I was like, I had a backpack on, a little plaid shirt. I was like, all right, so I grabbed arms with these young brothers from St. Louis and we blocked the street. In the middle of the street, here I am, nearly 40 years old, and I'm hearing my dad in my head. We don't block the street. You don't block the street. This is not how you bring about change. You bring about change. You make peace through incremental, change, incremental steps. You don't block the street. Somebody could be coming down the road, who needs to get home. Or I started going through all these dynamics. And in that moment, I also had to recognize that peacemaking is, again, not about protecting the status quo, but about inserting yourself into obvious conflict. That Jesus going into the temple was about Jesus making peace and removing injustice, and it was not pretty, and it was not comfortable. And if you probably would have read the papyrus book of Jesus' day, somebody was probably upset about what he did in the temple. Somebody said, those people are in there just trying to earn their money. They're just trying to do what it is that they need to do. Who is this crazy rabbi that comes in here and thinks he can come and disrupt the temple and throw everything upside down and make all this noise? He's a rebel rouser and we should have him killed. This is the person we worship. And yet when we see the way in which he lives, sometimes showing up in our world, we can easily become the very people who killed Jesus. Right? So, I'm there in Ferguson one night, I'm realizing all of this. I'm having all of this contradiction of thinking about, trying to be a peacemaker, being in the middle of this conflict, and I'm blocking the street. Have another story and moment where I'm standing there on the protest line, law enforcement's there, and I'm standing next to a young brown sister, and she's screaming to the top of her lungs, I'm a human being, I'm a human being, I'm a human being. You care more about a dog than you do me. You go home happy, I go home sad. I'm a human being, I'm a human being. And she's just screaming this for like 2 hours with tears rolling down her face. And I remember standing there in that moment that night, and with all of my story, I said, there is a brokenness in her that is not in me. And I have an opportunity as somebody that's following Jesus to think about how do I respond to that suffering, that sorrow, and the injustice that she's experiencing that is causing this level of despair, right? Which meant for me that I was going to have to come into a direct confrontation with some of the systems in this country in order to try to bring about the change. So what did that look like for me? In Ferguson, we protested, we organized. We did a lot of work to figure out how to help the family and bring about what we felt was justice, not just around the situation of Mike Brown, but also for many of the families that have been living under systemic injustice and structural racism for some time. I went to jail in Ferguson. I've never been to jail in my life, but went to jail in Ferguson for refusing to obey the laws. We protested in the streets. We marched onto the Ferguson police station. We resisted. When I came back, going back and forth from Ferguson to Oakland, I was still training Oakland's police department. So here's what I want to hold up for us when we think about peacemaking. Oftentimes, when we think about peace, there's this idea that we can only work on one side of what's broken in the equation. And I want to challenge that notion for us. This notion that, so when I think about the policing conversation, I always tell police when I'm training them, I'm not pro-police and I'm not anti-police. I'm pro-community. I'm pro-people. And what I'm trying to call the police is that the system is broken. It was never designed to serve everybody. And we need to change this system so that the people who are unjustly being impacted by the system can have some freedom. And then you yourselves who are part of this system can experience more freedom. Because the system of policing is killing both the target and the tool. Unfortunately, there are 70 felonious homicides of officers that happen every year. The whole country. There's 1,000 police killings that happen every year, with black men particularly being the highest rate of being unarmed folks who are killed. But there are 300 police officers that are committing suicide every year. So the very system that they're in is actually destroying them. The system is killing more of them than anybody from the community is killing the police. Right? So when we think about this notion of peacemaking, I want to be inviting us to be thinking about how we Dr. John Powell from UC Berkeley says, can we imagine a table large enough for everyone's suffering? right? That in this notion around policing, the system is broken and everybody is involved in suffering, but there obviously is more suffering on the side of those who are people of color in this story. So let me move this forward a little bit. So I got involved in a lot of peacemaking work, going back and forth, being in Ferguson, coming, back to California, training law enforcement around implicit bias, around something called procedural justice, and ultimately beginning to create these spaces where we are working with law enforcement in the rooms to bring about change, to reform the system, and I stayed active protesting in the streets. So I'm gonna out myself a little bit. When those freeways get shut down here in the Bay Area during times, that's normally me. When 880 got shut down a couple years ago, after Alton Sterling and Philando Castile got killed, the night that the Dallas police officers got killed, that was me. When Stephon Clark just got killed in Sacramento, we were on the freeway, that was me. Now equally, I'm on the streets in those spaces, pushing against the systems, and I am still training and developing reform practices with law enforcement all the time to try to change the system. Working with the Department of Justice at the state level of California to try to transform the policing system, co-chair the Racial Identity Profiling Board, doing a lot of this work to exist in the middle to bring about the change. What I want to invite us to think about is, let me tell this quick story too. So this is actually when we were in Ferguson. This image came actually from the night that I just told you about, when I was standing next to the young sister who was screaming at the police and lifting up her voice. When we jumped out, somebody called me. They said, "Ben, get over here to West Florissant. It's going down between the young people and the police." So I rolled around. Now there in the middle of the street is my friend Bill Coley, white brother. And Bill used to be a police officer, used to be a pastor with the Vineyard, and he and I, started building deep friendship several years ago. So as I was going back and forth with Ferguson, he told me, he was like, "Man, I got to go to Ferguson with you." I said, "Why?" He was like, "I just feel like God's telling me I got to go." I said, "Well, catch a plane and meet me here. We'll be here. We'll figure it out when you get here." He's got his own story. His best friend partner that he went through the academy with got killed by a young person of color, execution style with a traffic stop. We get there to Ferguson. I jump out of the car, go running into the crowd to get in between the police and the young people, and I don't see Bill. And so I kind of start looking around. Where's Bill at? About 15, 20 minutes later, I saw him in the back of the crowd. Another 30 minutes later, he got closer towards me. When we finally got back to the room and we pulled up the news reports to see how they covered that night, we saw this image on MSNBC with Bill standing in the middle of the street. And so I asked him, I said, "What was going on for you in that moment?" He said, "Well, you had jumped and ran into the crowd." And he said, and I was like, "I don't know if I want to run into that crowd. I don't know if I belong in that crowd. That crowd is screaming, 'F the police.' That's not what I believe. I don't know if I belong in that space." He said, "But I love you. And you were in that crowd." And he was like, I kind of got stuck for a minute in the middle of the street until ultimately I started moving a little bit at a time and a little bit at a time to get closer in there. I'm lifting up that story because being involved in peacemaking means that we're going to insert ourselves into conflict, but we won't do so unless we are in deep, loving relationships with people that will move us across the street into the crowd. Right? And based upon your situatedness and your story, right, means that peacemaking means that there's an opportunity to step into spaces, not to lead, but to follow. Right? So when I showed up in Ferguson, I came with my own arrogance to lead, not realizing that I actually had a lot to learn, and I ended up having to learn to follow the leadership of young people, and particularly young women of color, young black women, right? That I had to realize that my patriarchy, y'all know what I mean when I say patriarchy? Right? My patriarchy, my paternalism, right? That I had to check all of that, particularly a lot of it that I had learned growing up in the church. And I had to check a lot of that and figure out how to show up, follow the leadership of the people who are most oppressed, and then figure out how to work alongside them to serve their interests. So let me wrap some of this up in just a couple concepts I want to give you all. Well, let me finish this and I'll give a couple concepts, then we'll go to some questions. So what I'm trying to hold up for us in these stories is that peacemaking is about holding both sides of challenge, but ensuring that you are there to bridge, to bring about reconciliation while you hold up those who are most oppressed in any kind of dynamic. So what we've continued here in California is I got blessed after that, after Philando, Alton, and the Dallas police officers and the Baton Rouge police officers were killed. We launched the state's largest trust building project between police and communities of color. And it's called Building Trust Through Reform. Because initially, after the police officers were killed, a lot of the funders and folks were talking to a lot of us who were advocates saying, well, we got to figure out, how to get the community to trust the police. Like maybe we should, resource, ice cream cone with a cop and have coffee with a cop. And I told them, I said, that's not how you're going to make peace between these communities. You're going to make peace when we can change the system so people aren't getting killed disproportionately. And we got to figure out how to augment and bring about change. But it can't happen by police working in one room by themselves. It's not going to happen with those of us that are activists and organizers and community folks working in the room by ourselves. We got to figure out how to work at the same table, to figure out how to practice that salute principle, to see each other, to recognize we're all coming with different stories and different realities. There also is a disproportionate effect of how some of us are being impacted by the story, but we'll work together to create solutions that can change the system. And so we launched this Trust and Reform project, which is now active in 14 cities across the state, where you've got law enforcement, activists, community, formerly incarcerated folks, victims of crime, sitting down at tables and actually redesigning the policing system to try to bring about a change, right? Now, it is very hard work because for the police, I'm too much of an activist. And for folks in the community, I'm too close to the police, right? So this idea of peacemaking, though, is this idea of us figuring out how to exist in a very unpopular space. But actually the space that needs to happen if we're going to bring about any change. Everybody say bridging. Bridging. And say breaking. Breaking. Say it again, bridging. Bridging. And breaking. Breaking. So I think one of the things even we as people who are in the church are going to really have to think about in these moments, whether it's around policing, whether it's around, other kinds of other political issues, is us thinking about how we take the opportunity to do more bridging instead of breaking. Because right now what we have a lot going on is breaking. Now, that is going to mean that for dominant culture folks, right? For white folks, all right? I love y'all, right? But for white folks, that means that to do peacemaking and a lot of the work that needs to happen, you're going to have to figure out how to decenter yourself from the story. Right? And figure out how to bring in more perspectives and hold more perspectives. Because whiteness has been synonymous with American since the beginning of this country. So the whole notion of like, what is an American thing to do or what's normal oftentimes has been created through the construct of whiteness. So if we're going to build peace and bring about change, then it really is going to mean that for, white folks, dominant culture folks, we'll have to figure out how to decenter ourselves a little bit and how to learn the story around what's happening through the eyes of people of color, the eyes of women, the other people that are experiencing oppression in different ways and spaces. Particularly around the policing conversation, there's a couple things I want to hold. Everybody say perspective. Perspective. And say proximity. Proximity. So one of the things that we're going to have to do is figure out how to bring in more perspectives into our world and create a rhythm of bringing in more perspectives into our world, and we're going to have to close our proximity to people's pain. So the further you are away from the story, the less you will be able to understand the story, right? So what are things that people can do? And then I'll be quiet. Because it's like we throw all these abstract concepts and all of these stories, and it's like, what do you need to do? So here's what I oftentimes say to people. You don't need to create new structures to work on these kinds of problems. There are people who are already working on these problems. Blackaby, the writer, says, find out where God is at work in the world and join God, right? So what I encourage people to do is find an organization that is working on these issues and simply start showing up at their meetings. And find an organization that's led by people of color that are working on these issues, preferably women of color. And I say that as a man of color that's leading the racial justice organization. But show up at these meetings and recognize, and this is for people of color as well, right? It's not just, white convo, right? That all of us, if you're not involved in this work, we got to get involved in this work, because those of us that have more privilege than I do, some of us got education, some of us got resources, we got good families, etc., maybe not be overexposed to some of this. Show up to these places and recognize that, be prepared that 80 to 90% of what's talked about in the meeting you're going to disagree with. So come prepared to experience that. Right? Don't come going like, okay, let's see what these people don't talk about, and oh, that's wrong, and that's wrong. Come into these spaces and be prepared that 90% of this I'm going to think is BS, and I'm going to think this is wrong, and be listening for the 10% that you can agree with. Because a lot of our experience that keeps us out of the peacemaking work that we so desperately need to be a part of is, we don't stay around it long enough to learn the language, to see people, to understand people's perspectives. So I really want to be inviting people to take opportunities to step into an organization that's led by people of color, keep attending, learn about the issues from their perspective, and then find ways to leverage whatever privilege you have towards change, which means, for some people that can mean showing up at a protest, knowing that 90% of what's happening there you're going to disagree with, but you're there to recognize the 10. That might mean showing up at a city council meeting, knowing that 90% of the stuff you're going to disagree with, but you're listening for the 10. That might be accompanying an immigrant family to a deportation hearing. Whether you agree with that or not, saying I'm going to show up with people and be with them in the middle of their pain as they go through this issue. Adults, we have to, we're not going to think our way into new ways of acting. We have to act our way into new ways of thinking. Right? So I really want to encourage us as we're thinking about peacemaking. I could go on and on and on, but we would need a lot more time. But what I want to hold up for us is that we've got some real issues that are going on right now. And the church has to be involved in these issues. I'm going to close with this, and then we'll get some questions. Comments, pushback. I'm down for that too. All right? But I oftentimes say, where was the church during the Holocaust? Where was the church during slavery? Right? I really have to argue against the idea that the church was alive and present while Africans were being raped, tortured, and enslaved. Because what kind of gospel is that if it is not living in intersection with the brokenness of what's happening? Now, the people that ultimately ended slavery was the church that started rising, the abolitionists. That imagined, this is how prophetic these folks were, white and black folks, who imagined that the largest industry that was fueling the country, they imagined prophetically that one day it would not exist. And they began acting into that prophetic imagination. And now, those of us could never imagine slavery here. You just, you can't imagine it. That anybody, if somebody were to take a human being and say, I own them as property, all of us go, that's crazy, right? But it was because people of faith had prophetic imagination and began to step as a peacemaker to bring about change. What I want to offer for us is that the ways in which this country is still broken, we're going to have to be the people that stand up, that insert ourselves into a lot of this conflict and ultimately help to bring about the change. What we can't do is sit on the sidelines. And just finishing up with that, framing around the Holocaust. When you read it, and I know a lot of us have, and when I spent time, I was over in Israel, Palestine last year, and I was going through Yad Vashem, the Holocaust Museum there. And it just tells this story on how many of the Germans sat by and they didn't believe the horrors that the Jews were telling them was happening until it was too late. So as people who follow God, we're going to have to be people who get off the sidelines. We cross the street. We figure out how to move into some of these other spaces, learn other people's story, take in different perspectives, close our proximity to people's pain, start investing in more bridging instead of breaking, find and create tables that are large enough to hold everybody's suffering, and recognize that as a peacemaker, you're most likely, it's going to be very uncomfortable, and you're most likely going to get a lot of critique from a lot of people because most folks want to think at one side versus the other side. But the church has got to be the people that actually steps into the space where conflict is, whether it's around policing, whether it's around other forms of structural and systemic injustice. We're going to have to be the people who do more than pray. We're going to have to be the people that actually step into the middle of the story. All right? Let me take several questions and just thoughts, things that are popping up for folks.
To what extent is voting and politics involved in the change that you're talking about?
Very much so, very much so. And I think, very much so. I think
What's the question, please?
the question was, how much does voting and politics, did I say it right? Voting and politics play a role in bringing about the change? Very much so. The thing that I want to push on folks all the time, this is controversial, all right? That people with power and privilege, I don't think should vote their own interests. I think you should vote the interests of the marginalized. Proverbs says, speak up for those who cannot speak for themselves. Defend the rights of the poor and the needy. Voting is one way that we can speak up for those who do not have a more powerful voice. So myself as somebody, I've got power and privilege. I never in a moment where I feel like I got to go wake up and hit somebody over the head to take their wallet to go feed my family. Because I got relationships. Even if I fell out of work right now, I have tons of relationships that would make a very safe landing for me, and I'd have ways to get myself back together. So I really think voting is a big part of it, but I do think we should vote the interests of the marginalized, which means, again, listening to other people's perspectives, learning their stories, and learning what they need, and then voting for what they need, which sometimes might be against your own interests. But I think we've got to ask ourselves, a part of this peacemaking notion is making sure that we are functioning as Christians more than we're functioning as Americans.
I'm going to direct it toward the police department.
I'm saying one more time?
I'm going to direct this toward the police department.
Mm-hmm.
And I'd like to know, since you do work with the Oakland, what is the percentage of corruption inside the Oakland Police Department?
Yeah, I don't know what that hard data point is. What I will say is these systems, the Oakland Police Department, they need our involvement. The department of my city, I mean, it was real public a couple of years ago, was involved in a rape scandal of a young woman from our community that involved 12 or 13 other agencies. And you can see the problems in it. Here's the dynamic. For me, working closely with the Oakland Police Department, I have sat in the room with the former assistant chief, one of the current deputy chiefs, who behind the scenes say we know who the bad officers are. I told them, I said, started asking all the shooters, who's the dirtiest cop in Oakland? They all said the same name. I went in and told one of the guys who was on the executive team, I said, they told me this is the dirtiest officer. He dropped his head. It's like, we can't do nothing about him because the chief keeps him in because he does the stuff nobody else wants to do. And this is a black officer. So this is not a white officer. Both of them are black. Both the worst cop in the city and the one I'm talking to. Well, we can't do that. If you just keep working with me, and then once I become the chief, then I'll fix all the issues. So now, and I'll tell you, and this is one of the things that breaks my heart every time I tell the story, but I have to out myself. I'm going to tell my failure stories. In 2014, some of the young brothers I was working with around the violence told me that cops were raping young women from the community. And I did not believe them. And I went and I told one of the assistant chiefs at that time, I said, man, these guys are saying that a couple of these cops they said they were having orgies with these young women, but people who were underage, which to me is rape, well, according to the laws, right? And I said, that can't be happening. No cop, if he knows, like, people know that their own cop are going to be doing this, where people could just be seeing them, my own naivete. Then 2 years later, I had to swallow that hard pill when that scandal broke. And recognize that the young brothers told me what was happening, but I chose not to believe them. Instead, I chose to believe the police. And so now my orientation as a peacemaker is I believe the oppressed, and I force the system to prove that they're wrong. I don't cede trust and belief to the system because the system is broken. I believe the oppressed. And then I tell the people with power, you have to prove to me that they're wrong. And that's just another shift. If we would begin to shift ourselves towards just easily believing what systems and structures say, to giving a little bit more ear, that's part of that proximity with people that are in pain, I think it'll make a big difference. A couple more before folks get out of here. Brother.
I wonder what a silent protest, how effective that would be with all the signs would be compared to the protests with vitriol and shouting in the cop's face. There are probably some good cops in that line, but they take a lot of abuse too. And I look at the one group, whether it's black, brown, or white, protesting, and they're angry as heck, and they're saying things that normal people really wouldn't say, right to the face of the people that are there to protect them, as opposed to the silent protest with the signs blocking or doing whatever. I wonder which would be more effective. Because you're not making friends with any of the police officers by the things you're saying to their face.
Well, my response to that is I don't think the purpose of showing up is to be friends with the officers. And of course, I do believe that all people should be treated well. But at surface level, I think your observation kind of overlooks the trauma that the other people might be showing up with. And so obviously there might be a lot of good officers on the front lines, right? But to the points that were mentioned earlier, these people are coming out here angry because you mentioned 4 generations of trauma and of police brutality. And so I think the reality is that sometimes the officers will be confronted with that anger, but that's because they are a part of this larger system. And your point earlier, you mentioned we kind of have to stray away from taking things so personally because it's not necessarily directed at the good officers, right? But it's just the system. And so when we're looking at things in the media, we're like, my God, how could those people be so evil to the officers, right? But it's not even about the officers. It's about the generations of trauma, of being abused, of carrying all that pain, anger, and frustration. And at that moment, that's when it's all put on the table. And so your question was about a silent protest versus those who are outraged. And so I'm curious to know, what's your answer to the question? Which would you prefer? And maybe why not necessarily the answer in this space, but because we are thinking about perspective, what are the pros and cons of both, and why? What kind of sparked you to even ask that question? I think that will help all of us tap into the perspectives that we all have and the lens that we're also operating from.
Yeah. That was great. That was dope. Dope was great. But one of the things I just would say in partnership with our sister is it kind of underscores the need for us to draw closer to folks and to actually learn and spend time around people so we can learn why people are making those choices. Because, as she was appropriately saying, the trauma that folks have experienced is very, very, very deep. It's very, very, very old. I'll share just a quick story I gave the police when I'm training them. When I was in Ferguson, there was one night I went and got in between the police and the community, and I turned around and looked at one of the officers, and I just gave him like a nod, just let him know, listen, man, I'm not here to, get no direct confrontation with you. I'm trying to figure out how to help keep the peace right here. And I turned around, and then one of the young sisters, she looked at me, she was like, I saw you in Medford, and she just went in on me, like 0 to 60. She was like, I had my collar on too, so sometimes when I'm in the streets, I wear a clergy collar. She was like, you serve that white God, and she just went in on me, boom, boom, are you down with him? And she just went in on me, and I just stood there. And it was hard. It was hard to hear, right? Then I saw her the next day. I had on my street clothes and my cap on, and I walked by her. We were in this arena because Cardinal West was coming to speak, and I said, what's up, sis, how you doing? She was like, what's up, brother, good to see you. Now, here's one of the things I tell the police. I said, she didn't have a problem with being McBride. She had a problem with my uniform. And what I had to realize is that she was carrying trauma from my uniform. Because there's been that my uniform, which is something positive to me, but could represent for a lot of folks, people have been failed by the church, people have been failed by faith leaders, people have been molested, people have been oppressed. So one of the things I just had to realize was she wasn't upset with me, she was upset with my uniform, and it gave me an opportunity. This is what I tell the police. I said, people's critique is not about y'all as individuals. It's about your uniform, which represents the system. And I had the opportunity either to put the burden back on the person who was already traumatized, or to say, I'm actually going to take that as an invitation to hold those in my institution, preachers, more accountable. Because we're not doing things that is causing people to feel safe. And what I've told the police is you're going to have to do the same thing. So I think, again, this is why I'm always encouraging us to figure out how we can close our proximity to pain. It might not be realistic for you to show up at a racial justice organization meeting. You might say, great, Ben, I'm about to go get something to eat. I'm not doing that. But I would also, begin to tap into emerging younger leaders that you have here around the congregation and figure out what are they doing and how are they tapping in to learning and being involved in struggle, whether it's being online, whether it's resourcing people that might be doing that. But there's some way for us to be involved, but I'm always encouraging us to do more than just write checks. Because writing checks does not form us. We've got to get involved. And we've actually got to, risk something and be in space where we can ask some of those questions. One more question, and then we'll get out of here. Yes?
So how do you talk with, if you're talking to someone and they say something and you're like, it's not overtly racist, but it's the sort of implication stuff where they're basically imagining systematic racism doesn't exist, or the person who was affected by this, they should have done something different and then it wouldn't have gone that way, or all that type of stuff. How do you speak against that when you're personally not the one who's been affected? You've just heard other people say stuff, because it can be they respond to you and they're like, well, why are you an authority on it? You're not an authority on it. And I know I'm not, but I also don't want them to just keep on saying that stuff. How do you get them to listen to the people who they think are in the wrong?
So one of the things I would be encouraging that's a fantastic question. One of the things I want to be encouraging us all to do is not to wait until it's raining to start building a boat. Right? I love, the whole story of Noah, because it's Noah being warned of God, Hebrews 11, was moved with fear and reverence and built an ark to the saving of his house. And his family lived in what he built because they were able to survive the flood. So we all need to be in the practice of developing tools, anti-racism tools, on a regular basis that is training us and keeping us sharp on how to manage conversations around race. how to manage people who are being racist. Structures that invite us also to think about how to confront and challenge systemic injustice. So one of the great, tools that I'll put in front of folks, one, if you're following being in more progressive spaces and it doesn't have to be as faith-centered, there's a great organization called Surge, Standing Up for Racial Justice, which does a lot of great anti-racism training and tools. It's free. They have events that happen every month. And again, these are one of those things you can go and just start learning tools on how to have conversations around race. There's a lot of different people there, right? So if that's too deep in the water, don't go there. If you need something that's a little bit more kind of rooted in Christianity, Lisa Sharon Harper is a resource that I encourage people to read her books. There's a lot of great tools around anti-racism work and how to develop tools. And she also really helps folks think about how to have these conversations about race and injustice, even within the church and within a Christian context, so that we can help those of us that are in the body who are wrestling around some of this. Another resource is Dr. Brenda Salter McNeil, which is another resource that I encourage folks. So I would use some of those resources and just work on developing your tools. Final thing I'll say, and then I'm done, because we gotta go. I'm like Paul, I got 13 finalists. When I first started in the peacemaking work, I was terrible at it around violence. I was so nervous when I was sitting. The first time I sat across the table, I'm in a room with. When we do this peacemaking work, we sit in a room that's like this big, and it's a big square table, and we bring like 25 shooters in to the room, and they all sit one chair away from each other. And then there was like 5 to 8 cops in the room. But I'm sitting in the room first before the cops get in there. It's just the brothers in the community, and these are people who've been shooting at each other. And I showed up in this conversation as a square preacher with a lot of privilege. I didn't know how to do none of this. I was insecure. I was scared. We actually had to do one peacemaking session without the police because the brothers wouldn't come together if the police were involved. So we're sitting in the Imani Community Church over in Diamond District in Oakland, and we had 20 guys sitting in a room. I know people have guns. There's no police there, and I'm sitting there scared. There was a piano in the corner, and I was like, if it goes down, I'm jumping underneath the piano. I'm praying that God saves. I'm just keeping it all the way real, right? This is terrifying work, but the more you close your proximity to it, and you stay consistent with it, then you begin to develop a muscle for it. So I want to encourage us not to believe, like I don't do the whole superhero activism stuff that somehow you just wake up, with superpowers. You develop it over time, and it's still hard for me. I'm challenged right now doing my work around patriarchy, figuring out how to be a better ally for women, and particularly black women. And so when I step into conversations around gender, I get tense and, the way I used to, because whenever you're learning and you're growing and figuring out how to be a peacemaker, it's going to be hard. So I just want to encourage us, step into those moments, be consistent, develop your tools, but we need y'all in this work. And lastly, if you don't do anything, one of the best ways you can make peace, to the point of what our brother said, vote. But when you do, vote the interests of the marginalized. So if you do anything, take the next 4 to 5 months. And I'm talking in generality, so I hope nobody feels like I'm not here to judge anybody or assume what people are, but I'm a talking head, which means I got to talk in generalities. But as much as you can over the next 3 to 4 months, figure out what the interests of the marginalized are here in your neighborhood, your community where you work, live, and play, and figure out how to vote those interests, and as much as you can, figure out how to get into deep relationship with people that are dealing with a higher level of oppression than what you're feeling, and let's figure out how to make some peace together. All right? Thank you.